Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be discussing the situation surrounding the ACC right now. There were a lot of people that came out and said after the committee's decision to leave an undefeated ACC champion out of the playoff, this is a telltale sign that the ACC is officially dead and or dying. And I don't think that's the number one reason. I mean, obviously, there were extra circumstances. If Jordan Travis is healthy, I certainly think FSU gets into the playoff. But a telltale sign, and this is what was happening to the Pac-12, that a conference is dying. Look at their conference championship attendance. If you look at that game, FSU versus Louisville, and it was not a good game. It was FSU with a backup quarterback against a Louisville team who wasn't very good. The ACC is really weak right now. But if you look at the game, they were tarping off sections of the upper deck. It's the exact same thing they used to do when the Pac-12 championship was at Levi's Stadium. There is just not a demand in this conference, and you see Clemson, a former powerhouse, kind of coming down to earth. FSU is really good, but again, they're the team that just got left out of the playoff undefeated. A lot of people saying FSU should be pissed off because of this result. They should be looking to get out. My argument would be, I think if FSU was in a different conference like the SEC or the Big Ten, they wouldn't be undefeated because they'd probably be facing a much tougher team in their conference championship game. And in something like the Big Ten, you would either be facing a Michigan or Ohio State in the regular season or in your conference championship. So I think the only way FSU could have gone undefeated this year was in a conference like the ACC, especially towards the end of the season with that easier conference championship game against Louisville. FSU football leaving the ACC is paramount for the Noles, and you can see the argument, the trend associated with the rankings. I don't think this is really all that important, though, when it comes to something like the 4-team playoff, FSU getting left out. The 4-team playoff is gone. It's done. There's no more 4-team selection committee. If FSU were to go 13-0 next year, they would be in the playoff. I guess an argument can be made when it comes to the ACC and how weak it is. They could possibly only be getting one team, maybe at most 2 teams in the playoff next year, with all the SEC has, with Texas and Oklahoma joining, the Big Ten with the 4 Pac-12 schools joining. Those conferences are each going to take up probably a minimum of 3 spots, you would expect, maybe even more. Also you have to factor in the conference champions get an auto bid, so there'll be at least one team from the ACC, one team from the Big 12. Both of those conferences are very weak right now compared to the Big 10 and the SEC. So I don't think the argument is not, because FSU got left out of the 4-team playoff, they need to leave the ACC, because it's irrelevant. The 4-team playoff doesn't exist anymore. But what you could say is the ACC is becoming an irrelevant conference. If you look at the other powers, and what the SEC and the Big Ten are adding compared to the ACC, taking on SMU, Stanford, and Cal, it does make a lot of sense for FSU to say, look, we got to get in with the big boys. We're clearly not in with them right now. Same thing with Clemson, and possibly push to join one of the top conferences, very likely the Big Ten or the SEC. And you can talk about, FSU fits the SEC more, Clemson fits the Big Ten more, maybe vice versa. They're going to want either one. There's no question about that. The question is, how can they get out of the terrible current ACC contract through 2036? We lost the Pac-12 this year. I've been saying this for months. The ACC is a dead conference walking. Today finished it off. And yeah, there were a lot of questions that were raised right before the season. We remember it went public, SMU, Stanford, and Cal joining the ACC. And some people were like, they're just expanding because they want to keep up with the other conferences. I think more so it was because the ACC knew there was a very big possibility that they would be losing multiple schools, possibly 4, maybe even more, to other conferences. They wanted to kind of get out ahead of it and say, look, we're going to keep our conference together. Right now, my prediction is based on what the ACC is doing. They're gearing up to become a mid-major conference, in my opinion. Now, a lot of this depends on how the grant of rights gets solved, how do teams get out of that, but let's just say it ends up happening. The ACC can still operate with the Boston Colleges of the world, with the Wake Forest. You got SMU now in your conference. You've got Stanford and Cal. possibly adding a few more Mountain West teams to maybe even form a bigger West Wing, because we know how ridiculous that travel would be right now on both Stanford and KILL, and they would want to alleviate it. And maybe one of the thought processes behind them joining this conference is there'll be other teams joining as well. I think the ACC is due for some serious turmoil, possibly losing tons of teams, but adding a bunch as well, possibly becoming the premier mid-major conference by getting their pick of the litter out of the Mountain West, out of the American, and what have you, and also keeping several teams. I mean, where's Boston College going to go, in terms of would they go to the Big Ten or the SEC? There's just no way. And then it's like the only thing that they can really do is stay in the ACC. Same thing with a team like Wake Forest, maybe a few others. Syracuse, you could argue their basketball program, possibly they could get into the Big Ten, but they could possibly be another team that would stay in the ACC. And it becomes, this is what people thought might happen to the Pac-12. The Pac-12 just straight up completely dissolved because now there's only 2 teams left, and they're basically de facto joining the Mountain West. I mean, most of their games are going to be against Mountain West teams, although I don't think they're going to be eligible to compete in that conference championship. But this is a situation where it's like 4 or 6 teams stay in the ACC. They're, I guess, technically adding 3 already, with SMU, Stanford, and Cal, and then possibly adding a bunch more, the pick of the litter, all of the top group of 5 teams, and then the ACC becomes the top group of 5 conference. I mean, think about it. They're already, they already don't care about where they get their teams from. They're adding 2 teams from California and 1 team from Texas. So the ACC understands if they want to survive, they need to adapt, and you're seeing FSU, again, the whole FSU being left out of the playoff, that's going to cause the ACC to dissolve. That's overblown completely because there were other circumstances at play. If FSU was completely healthy, even though this year it's very weak in the ACC, FSU still would have made the playoff, even with the ACC being as weak as it is, as if Jordan Travis was healthy. So I think, that's kind of just, this really isn't a situation where it's like, it's not like FSU is a group of 5 champion perfectly healthy and they're getting left out of the playoff because the conference is so weak. That's not what's going on here. Now, certainly it didn't help FSU that they played Louisville, and obviously, maybe it did help them because maybe if they would have faced a tougher team, they would have lost, but just in general, you would like a better win with your backup quarterback in the conference championship game to show the committee that you are a formidable team, even with a backup QB. Again, they might have lost if they would have faced a better team, but I'm just saying in general, I don't think FSU being left out because of the other circumstances surrounding it is necessarily the death blow for the ACC. I think when you look at the context of the ACC as a whole, though, the horrible TV deal, the fact that it seems like they're nervous, they're going to be losing teams, that's why they added, like almost panic added 2 teams from across the country. Geographically, it makes absolutely no sense. I think in general, the writing is kind of on the wall for the ACC. I mean, we're seeing college football evolve so fast with all of these kids transferring. They're leveraging their NIL. Everyone is just blatantly cheating in NIL. It's completely off the rails. And I do think at some point, I mean, if you are FSU, if you're Clemson, even North Carolina, NC State, your value is so much greater. It might even make sense to where, let's say you can't even get out of the grant of rights. You got to pay a massive exit fee. Paying that exit fee in the grand scheme of things might make sense. You got to do it pretty soon, though, and then get into the Big Ten and really reap those benefits. Again, I don't know exactly where the teams would go. There's been reports that the Big Ten might be more interested in a team like FSU than the SEC, but it's just so early when it comes to a situation like this. This type of stuff normally is saved for the summer, and I'm sure it's going to heat up significantly based on what's been happening in the ACC this past season. The conference was really down again, and FSU did get left out of the playoff, although I do think that's more of a media spin talking point, like, oh, FSU, they're so angry at their conference for how weak it is, so they're going to have to leave. It doesn't matter. There's no more 14 playoff. It doesn't exist anymore. There's going to be no more decision like that. If you're an undefeated team in the ACC, next year, you're 1,000% going to be in the playoff. I will say the ACC, based on how weak it was this year, they would have only gotten 1 team in the playoff, and it wouldn't have even been close because the second best team in that conference, honestly, is Clemson, but they have 4 losses. So you're talking about a 12-team playoff. The Big Ten getting 3 teams in for sure with Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State. The SEC, you're looking at 3 or 4 teams, Georgia, Alabama, Ole Miss, maybe Missouri. And you're talking about a group of 5 team being possibly, Liberty, who is undefeated right now. Although this year for group of 5s, I do think it's a little bit weak. I honestly think Boise State, even though they have a lot of losses based on how they've been playing recently, they might be the best group of 5 team right now. And they're going to be dangerous next year. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.